Hey, you! You! Yes, you! You look like the typical nerd with good marks in sci fi movies. You're not very fond of sport, right? I bet you had a hard time in high school, but you thought there were no bullies in college, right? That's just an assumption. An assumption! You need to make it sure, and statistics can help you with that. The high school bully that we all have watched in TV might be closer than you think. In order to identify this possible menace, we will state some of his typical characteristics. He is a man, usually heavily built and good looking. He practices a lot of sport and might be the captain of the football team, and he does not study a lot.
I like to rap dirty. I like to fight dirty. I like to drink dirty.
We will also assume that he does not read many books, and finally, he is a bully and usually heterosexual, so we'll assume he is against the legalization of gay marriage. We carried out a survey on 127 journalism students that included those and other questions. We will compare the results that we obtained to try to prove if the myth of the college bully is real or not. We don't know which one of these is the independent variable, so we calculated tables for all the possible combinations. Let's start with average hours of sport in terms of weekly hours of study. The model quantity of hours of study is 3 hours a week, that comes with an average of 1.8 hours of sport a week. This shows that most people don't study a lot, but they don't do a lot of sport either. Most people then are not bullies. The minimum hours of study, 0, come with 6 hours of sport a week, which is not that much. On the other side, the maximum average hours of sport is 10. To this average corresponds the quantity of 20 hours of study, which is even over the third quartile of hours of study, 16. This means that those who study a lot more than the 75% of the people, they do the greatest average hours of sport. If we compute the table the other way around, we obtain the same conclusions. There are people that do a lot of sport but they study even more. And also people that do nothing at all, nor sport nor study. With the other variables, the results are similar. There is no evidence that being sporty implies being bull-like stupid. We keep receiving the notion that some people don't study nor read a lot, but that they don't save that spare time doing sport as the college bully will do. Besides, people in favor of same-sex marriage do over 7 times more sport than people who do not support gay marriage. If we create regression lines for the data, we observe the slopes are close to 0, which means that correlation slightly exists. The slope of the regression line depends on the correlation in direct proportion, so if correlation is small, then the value of the slope is so. In fact, there are some cases in which the slope is positive, implying that the more hours of sport, the higher are the values on the other variables. But wait a moment! You are a smart kid, and smart people don't trust data at first glance. The previous conclusions are right for the sample that we took, 127 journalism students at UC3M, but what about the whole population of students of journalism? Who knows the horror that dwells out there? Tsk, tsk. We can't rely only on the results, we have to infer in order to get the big picture. Inferential statistics might help us in this. Assuming that hours devoted to sport, hours of study, and exam grades in the whole population are continuous variables, we will treat them as normal or Gaussian distributions, bell-shaped distributions that are defined by their mean and their standard deviation. Agreement with same-sex marriage and the amount of books read are variables that could barely be considered normal distributions, so we'll take into account the 3 remaining variables. Sport hours are the most risky feature that someone might show in order to be accused of being a college bully. Therefore, we will base our inferential work on this aspect. Conditioning the results to men, we can obtain from the survey results that sport hours data have a mean of 3.75 hours and a variance of 12.47, which implies a standard deviation of 3.53. We can establish then the normal distribution n 3.75, 3.53. We will use the third quartile value 6 as a measure of great amount of hours devoted to sport. Using the normal distribution tables, we will compute the probability that the quantity of hours spent in sport is above 6. To do this, we need to standardize, which is to translate the data to a standard normal distribution using this formula. Once we have standardized the data, we want to know the chance that C is above 0.64. This event is the contrary event to being below 0.64. So we need to calculate if B is contrary to A, then probability of B is equal to 1 minus probability of A. Probability that someone spends more than the third quartile of hours doing sport is 0.26. Thanks to this data, we can affirm relieved that in the whole population the assumption of the college bully won't work either. We'll use the same method to check the probability that someone studies less than the first quartile of hours, mean standard deviation on the first quartile of the following. So we construct the normal distribution and compute the chance that someone studies less than 3 hours, which means being below the first quartile. The same happens with the marks obtained in the university exam. These are the mean, the standard deviation, and the first quartile, 10. We'll use the normal distribution tables once more and compute the chance that someone obtained a mark below the first quartile of the sample, which means being behind the 75% of the students that were surveyed. To be even more precise, we'll compute 3 confidence intervals, trying to approximate where the mean of hours of study, hours of sport, and marks obtained will locate in the normal. If results are similar to those we have obtained so far, we will be able to conclude that the denial of the bully TV myth is correct and supported by statistics. To compute the confidence intervals, we will use a 95% confidence level, which is a good level of reliability. The intervals will gather, therefore, 95% of the probability within them and leave 2.5% of the probability to both sides of the distribution. In those 5 out of 100 cases, our predictions would fail. Once we compute the interval for hours of sport, we can observe the upper limit of the interval is 4.6, and that it is smaller than the third quartile 6. Therefore, we can affirm that in 95% of the cases, people will spend 4.6 hours doing sport at most, which does not reach what we assume to be very sporty. This supports that the college bully who does a lot of sport doesn't exist. We'll compute the intervals for the other 2 variables, hours of study and exam marks. With the other variables, we obtain that the lower limits of hours of study and exam marks are both above their first quartiles. These conclusions lead us to think that in 95% of the cases, people in the population studies more than the quantity we find as very little, obtains higher marks than our college bully mark, and thus less sport than what we consider to be a lot of sport. With this final conclusion, With this final conclusion, we can affirm without fear that the college bully is American Aries stuff. If you belong to our population, there is 95% confidence that there is no danger in going outside and living life the nerd way. That's it.